It's the most wonderful time of the year. Happy Halloween, everyone. Happy October, everyone. I probably should get this out of the way. This looks bad. Just gonna put you down here so you can't do any more evil. Now I do also have to carve this pumpkin a little bit later, but we'll get to that. Well, happy October, everyone. Now that I've created quite a bit of a problem over here as a mess, welcome back to Movie Club. I am delighted that we're about to embark on my favorite month of the year, and we have a stacked month. Just this month, we're going to be tackling two movies tonight, Host from this year and the 1981 cult classic, The Evil Dead, but we'll also be tackling Scream, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, another Halloween movie, and plenty more, I think, fun stuff like The Thing. We've got a stacked month, and I'm not kidding. I clearly love this month, and I hope that you'll love what we've put together for this month, because I think it's both this mixture of delightfully fun stuff and funny stuff and things that don't take themselves very seriously, but also movies that will terrify you, because that is our goal. It is the month of scare, of spook, after all. But what I'm really excited about is our double feature for tonight. Man, am I excited for this. So, without further ado, let's get cracking. Okay, to kick off our double feature for tonight, which actually isn't that long of a double feature, we're not going to be hitting anywhere close to 3 hours, is a short, fast, and fun film from this year. 2020's own Host, directed by Rob Savage. And this film, I have just freshly seen it, so I'm delightfully excited to share it with you, because this film is so current and involved with our current circumstances. It is a film that was conceived, written, and shot all during quarantine. And, you know, it feels like it, and it is a fun way to kind of deal with some of the tension that comes with, being stuck at home alone. Because we are all meeting over Zoom or through limited in-person activity right now, and the best way to be safe is to talk with friends over Zoom. And that is the framing device for this film. It's a Zoom call from start to finish. And though it may play fast and loose with the 40-minute free time that you get for groups over 2, you won't care by the end of this film, because this film is lean, mean, and it gets to the point quick. It is 56 minutes from start to finish, and it earns every second of that. From the very outset, it feels like a lived-in and real world, because it is our current world that we live in. I actually really love this film, and big thanks to Kent Gunn for pushing me out of my comfort zone, because otherwise this would have been a month full of movies that I've either seen before or I'm at least intimately familiar with. And this film is brand new. Hadn't seen it before, wasn't a member of Shudder. I am now. I'm so glad that Kent pushed us out of my comfort zone, because we get to experience something new and interesting and different tonight with Host. It utilizes the way that we currently connect with one another and turns it on its head. We think that we're safe in our own homes because we're away from other people that could potentially infect us. But what if something could break through that veil and break through that protection barrier that we think we have and violate the sanctity of the privacy of our own houses? That's kind of the question that Host posits, because this is a movie about spirits and a seance that goes horribly, horribly wrong. And it does so in a way that I think is absolutely brilliant. Now, of course, with it only running 56 minutes, we don't get to know everybody's little backstory or everybody's little job and what they're doing. But the little touches of the fact that this is just one single conversation this friend group has, and just one point of connection, and that there's been plenty more connections in the past, is really compelling and really interesting to me. Because it helps us envelop in this world that feels like these old friends are getting together for a little bit more of a spooky night. And I think, what better film to start off October than something like this? Something that feels incredibly prescient and of the time right now. Now, I'll admit, to put on my little critic's hat for just a second, that I'm not entirely certain how this film will evolve in our watch after we get out of these COVID-infected times. Whether this film will be a cool, like, of the moment type thing, and then it'll be a horror movie that gets forgotten. I'm not sure about that yet. But right now, I feel like it's the perfect horror movie for our times. And if you typically watch these movies or these screenings on your television, I'd say, at least for this first film, watch it on your laptop. That's typically how you're going to be watching and communicating when you're on a Zoom call. So, since this film is literally framed in an actual Zoom call window, it will feel more real to you if you watch it in the way that these characters are typically engaging with the Zoom call. But we have a whole nother film that we'll be tackling after our brief 5-minute intermission in between. And that is the 1981 cult classic from Sam Raimi, The Evil Dead. If I have not professed my love for this film before, far be it from me to not profess it now, because this film is delightful. It is the spirit of indie incarnate, and I love it from the first frame to the last. Sam Raimi, you probably are more familiar with as the director of the original early 2000s Spider-Man trilogy starring Tobey Maguire. And those films are delightful. And something that I noticed in researching for this video was that there's kind of this weird tendency in the early 2000s to have major franchises helmed by directors that typically had only done horror films up until that point. And by that I mean Sam Raimi, who got famous making horror movies, was helming the 3-film Spider-Man trilogy in the early 2000s. But at the same time, Peter Jackson, who at that point was just this New Zealander who had made a really crass and disturbing R-rated horror films in his context, then became the director of one of the most beloved fantasy franchises of all times, and that was The Lord of the Rings from J.R.R. Tolkien. And now I think those were the perfect choices because they brought their sentiments and their indie spirit into this massive world, and so they wanted to do everything as real as they possibly could. And I think that benefited both of those franchises incredibly. We're not talking about Spider-Man tonight, and we're not talking about The Lord of the Rings. Tonight we're talking about the video nasty that is The Evil Dead. Now, you might not have ever heard the term video nasty, but what that term effectively references is the fact that upon its release, this film was deemed so gratuitously and disgustingly violent that it was made pretty hard to get access to. It was a legal term that was applied to these films that made it very, very hard for these movies to not only get a chance to be played in a screening house, but also the chance to be sold on VHS or the platforms of the time. And that's kind of baffling now, given what we've probably all seen on even television at this point, that when we watch this movie, and it's cheesy, and you can kind of tell how they did most of the special effects, you're a little bit like surprised. Like, really, this film? I mean, you had Cannibal Holocaust to go after, and you chose this film. To be fair, they did go after Cannibal Holocaust, and probably for very good reason, because that movie's very disgusting and hard to watch, and does look like there's a couple human rights abuses happening there. But luckily, they just murdered some bugs, so that's still pretty bad. I think they'd murder an animal, which is also pretty disgusting. But that's Cannibal Holocaust, not this movie. I'm getting off track. The Evil Dead is fascinating because upon its initial release, it was originally granted an X rating, which isn't a rating that really exists anymore. This is a rating so severe that most places of screening movies would not dare host it. Luckily, with a couple edits, they were able to get it down to the NC-17 rating, but that's still effectively a kiss of death in most mass markets. Because the NC-17 rating meant that you couldn't just go with your parents to see an R-rated film. You literally had to be 17 and up in order to even get a ticket. It's that serious. And films that were given this often didn't get as many screens to be played on, and they definitely didn't have as big of a market on the back end. But the way that most things go, like with banned books, is the limited access to it actually made it more intriguing. And this film eventually developed a cult following and actually had a pretty sizable fan base upon its initial release. And praise be to Stephen King for lending his voice to the matter and going out into the fray and declaring The Evil Dead one of the greatest movies he's ever seen. And because of his advocacy, more people were willing to give this disturbing film a chance. And thank God they did, because good Lord, this movie's fantastic, and we got 2 more films out of it. Now, the NC-17 rating might be scaring you right now, with good cause, because not many movies really get that rating. And if you're just a typical moviegoer, you probably haven't come across many movies with that rating that you would even be interested in watching. But rest assured, most of the stuff in this film is pretty dang cheesy, and you don't really have to worry about much, because effects have aged very poorly in most of these places. But that's part of the charm. Remember back when I did a video on Independence Day and I talked about camp? That especially applies to here. And Grace Lee of the great YouTube channel What's So Great About That did a whole video on it, and you should really check that out if you want to learn more about why this film is so endearing to film nerds like myself, and especially horror heads like me. Now, a little bit of quick history on The Evil Dead. This is a film made by people who had no clue what they were doing. They managed to barely scrap together the budget for a very, very low budget short film called Within the Woods. And that would be the duo of Sam Raimi and the star of The Evil Dead, Bruce Campbell. They then used the word of mouth to gather up quite a bit of money, like $350,000. Now, that's still a micro budget, both then and especially now. Most movies cannot get away with making anything under $1 million. And for this movie to do what it did on $350,000 is incredibly interesting. Because what it does is something incredibly original, but also it pulls from the icons of the horror genre, like Lovecraft. For me, the original The Evil Dead will always have my heart, because they were doing these cheesy special effects out of necessity. So when something incredibly gory happens and it lands and it makes you tense up, you have to recognize the fact that they were doing this with so little money that for them to pull off an effective effect that still works to this day is damn near genius. And like I said, this film owes a lot to the zombie films of yesteryear. And ironically enough, the producer of the original Night of the Living Dead is largely responsible for helping Sam Raimi get distribution for this film. The praise be to Irvin Shapiro for recognizing that there was something special about this movie that needed to be marketed worldwide. Because originally, this film was probably only going to get a limited release stateside. But Shapiro was helpful in helping Sam Raimi think outside the box and get together the marketing materials necessary to have this film distributed everywhere. I would be remiss to not mention the book that is at the center of this cult classic, and that is the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, or more colloquially, the Book of the Dead. This book has an incredible design and, at least in the world of this film, is bound in human flesh and written out in human blood. The book isn't the most horrific part of this. By reading passages from the Book of the Dead, you can uncover something even more horrific. And that is the monsters and the creatures at the heart of this film, known as the Deadites. While they're never technically called that in this installment, they do get that name by the second and third film in this franchise. So I'm just going to call them that to be safe and consistent. And of course we get the delightfully fun talent of Bruce Campbell as the lead of this film, Ashley Williams, more affectionately known as Ash. While he's not the comedy stalwart that he would eventually become and the B-movie king that he always was and will be, at this point in this film, the second film kind of turns up the comedy, at least the dark comedy, and maybe dials the horror back a little bit. Whether or not you're going to continue along the journey of Evil Dead on your own, I do think this film is both a fun way to look behind the scenes of cinema, but also to see kind of the makings of what will become a cult classic. Because cult classics are deeply interesting, and we're of course going to look at more in the future. Just stay tuned for that. Oh, and one more thing, because I feel like I have to mention this before we get into the film. There is one scene that I absolutely hate in this movie. And I'm just going to come out and say it, and this is a little bit of a spoiler. And kind of a topic warning as well if you don't necessarily care for sexual violence or rape. You might want to skip to whatever time code I put right here, so that way you can skip this. And also, if you're planning on skipping this segment of me talking about it, you might want to skip this movie. Just being frank with you. Or at least let me tell you when to skip part of the film. I'm of course talking about the famous tree rape scene in this film. It's incredibly disturbing, and for obvious reasons, it's meant to be. But it kind of feels exploitative for exploitative's sake, and it doesn't really add anything to the story for this to be a thing. Now, the director and Bruce Campbell have both come out saying that they regret having put this scene in the film at all, and they think it's kind of tasteless, and they definitely wouldn't do it now. But it's still in this movie, so I think I have to talk about it, because yes, it sort of makes sense that demons would do this, but at the same time, this just feels like a bridge too far. We're already seeing a bunch of gruesome acts happen. This is just something that we could do without in our little fun, cheesy horror film. And it's realistically the only scene in the movie that I sometimes skip, if I'm being perfectly frank. I'll just get up and go get water during that scene because I don't really feel the need to watch it. Okay, welcome back. I've finished talking about that. But once again, if you skip that segment or you did listen to that segment but feel that you want to skip it when we screen the movie, just you'll know when it's coming. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I do want to say, in all seriousness, I do love the two movies that we're about to screen tonight. Host is something that is brand new and fresh to me, and I feel like is fresh because it's so current in our current context. The Evil Dead is something that has outlasted many of the other films that comes from its era and has influenced so much media since then. It's made appearances in a variety of media since then, including Stranger Things. Both of these films, I think, to connect them in some little arbitrary way, are like one of the 5 million reasons I never want to participate in a seance. Hereditary is also on there. But these movies, in some kind of tangential way, just make me never want to mess around with any books of the dead or reading passages from things in languages that I don't know. And I definitely do not want to participate in a Zoom call with people who don't take spirits and stuff seriously. I barely do, so I'm definitely not participating in a seance, and especially not a seance over a Zoom call. That sounds like a bad time. But what I do love are these two movies and how they make me feel, because they do terrify me and I have a lot of fun with both of them. So I'm really excited to share these with you. So without further ado, Movie Club is proud to present our very first screening of October, a double feature of the 2020 film from Rob Savage, Host, and Sam Raimi's 1981 cult classic, The Evil Dead. Happy Halloween, everyone.